So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Power Platform Master Series. For those of you that are new here, the Master Series um, is designed to be an education resource surrounding the Power Platform and Copilot Studio. We aim to have a monthly, but often bi-weekly sessions with topics that are inspired and requested by you, the community. That said, we'd love your feedback. So feel free to reach out to me directly to make any suggestions or requests to make the Power Platform Master Series more valuable to you. Um, Today's session has been requested a lot, and I'm really happy and proud to have secured Leanne and Ryan from Microsoft IT to discuss how their very slim team manages more than 50,000 environments, quickly approaching 55,000 environments across more than 300,000 Microsoft employees. And as some of you may already know, managing that many environments can be a challenge. And I hope that today's conversation can be helpful to you and your teams. As usual, the Master Series sessions are intended to be more conversational and less of a presentation. So if you've got any questions along the way, feel free to come off of mute or simply ask your questions in the chat. We've got a team of resources that can help answer or address any of your concerns that you might have. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded. And I will be putting a copy of the recording and the slides on the Master Series Hub later today or tomorrow. So you guys can feel free to rewatch or distribute to anybody that might have missed it. Before I hand things over, I want to run a quick poll because I want to start off to kind of gauge how challenging you find it to govern and administer um, any stuff that you guys are working on today. So if you manage the Power Platform at your organization, how challenging do you find it to govern and administer daily? Um, you know, 1 star, super hard, 5 stars makes it super easy. So hopefully you guys land somewhere in between, but let me know. And as soon as we're done there, Leanne, Ryan, I will go ahead and just hand things over to you as we let these kind of come in.
Sounds good. I'm trying to figure out how I would answer this poll.
It's like we're getting, yep, right somewhere in between. And roughly half the folks, a little more than half, have responded at this point. So
Cool. All right.
all right,
Well,
guys, I'll
feel free
hand
to
things
keep
over to you.
answering. All
Yep.
right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time at whatever time of day it is for you to come listen to Ryan and I talk. It's weird for me that everyone wants to hear me talk at them for an hour, but I'm very excited that you're all here. I'm Leanne. I am a product manager in Microsoft Digital, which is Microsoft's internal IT team. I manage our governance program internally for Microsoft's corporate tenant. And Brian, would you like to introduce yourself too?
Sure, it'd be a joy. Hi, everyone. Ryan McDonald. I am one of the service engineers, one of the folks who has the permissions to press the buttons that Leanne and others often tell me to press. It's a collaborative effort, but as a team, we do pretty well.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like Jeffrey was saying, if you have any questions, I'll be pausing every couple of slides to take any questions that come in. So feel free to raise hands or drop the questions in chat. So a little bit more background. Like I said, we are from Microsoft's IT team. We are Microsoft Digital. This puts us in a fun situation where we are essentially a customer too. We are not part of the product team building the Power Platform products. We are Microsoft's IT, taking those products and figuring out how to implement them and use them safely in our own corporate tenant across all the employees at our corporation. It puts us in a unique position because we're usually the first ones to be testing everything and testing everything at such a massive scale. But we are in charge of doing everything from figuring out our governance and security strategy for Microsoft's corporate use, doing any sort of feature testing, enablement, adoption planning, end user support, as well as building at times custom tooling and solutions that help further extend what the product makes available. It's always finding that right balance between empowering Microsoft employees to use Power Platform to meet their needs, while making sure that they do that safely with the right guardrails in place and not doing silly things that keep us up at night. For a little bit of context on what our tenant situation looks like, I believe we still have the largest tenant in the world, at least when it comes to number of environments. I know some other customers are close or higher than us when it comes to number of apps and flows and whatnot, but I think we're winning the environment race. We just hit 53,000 environments in our tenant. It's about 1,000 new environments per week, mostly due to default environment routing that we turned on back in June. And I will talk about what that is and what that means in a moment. But we did have some pretty humble beginnings back in 2016 when we first enabled this in our tenant. And since then, I've seen pretty consistent growth, both in just number of resources and resource usage across our tenant over the last few years. And then obviously things have skyrocketed in the last couple of months and last year or so with all the new Gen AI capabilities, Copilot Studio agents, and just general interest in using the low-code platform. But as you can see, automation and scalable governance, super critical for us, because when you have 53,000 environments and over 1 million resources, you can't be manually managing them and trying to govern stuff through a UI. Ryan would never sleep ever again, and I would feel really bad about that. So we have tooling in place to help govern our tenant. In terms of a breakdown of those environments, most of our environments are personal developer environments. Again, this is because of the default routing that we turned on, which I will go into detail on in a moment. But right now, about 3/4 of all of our tenant is those personal developer environments. And then it's an even split amongst the rest for production, sandbox, and Dataverse for teams. In terms of who is using Power Platform at Microsoft, it's a big mix. It started out being very citizen development focused because it's a low code, no code platform, but we have seen a lot of adoption and usage amongst our technical teams as well. So we've got a pretty good mix of citizen developed and pro developed solutions. Some of the more popular use cases are things like automating business workflows, general personal productivity solutions, and then line of business applications for teams that might have smaller development budgets or more urgent timelines and need to develop something pretty quickly. Obviously, with all the recent AI integrations, there has been a pretty rapid usage increase in the bots/agents world, especially for end user support spaces. I'm not going to talk you through our list of top apps, mainly because the list of top apps in our tenant changes almost every day, depending on what events are going on, what time of year it is, that sort of thing. But it's, like I said, broadly used across Microsoft. We have teams in finance, HR, our legal organization, our engineering organizations, all building different solutions for whatever their business needs are. So getting into the fun stuff. In terms of how we govern, I look at it in sort of 3 buckets. The first one is what I call protect. This is all of the proactive security and governance controls that we apply at the tenant and at the environment levels, mainly through the Power Platform Admin Center. The things that stop people from doing silly things in the first place because we have those proactive blockers in place. Then there's the measure pillar. This is all of our inventory and compliance telemetry. You can't govern what you can't see, so it's important to have that data so that you know what you are applying rules to and how things are being used. And then there's the enforcement component. This is making sure that people are not doing silly things with their stuff, and if we do, notice that people are doing silly things with their stuff, we have a way to rectify that situation. So we have compliance-based lifecycle management where if we detect that you have done specific thing that we do not like, we notify you, give you a chance to fix it. Otherwise, we delete your things, which is super fun from our side. And just calling out, we do what we call macro level governance. So we're like the federal government here at Microsoft. We apply the rules that everyone across Microsoft has to follow. But because we're such a big organization, specific organizations or divisions within Microsoft might have their own governance programs as well that are even more granular. For example, we have the rules that apply. We're the big umbrella that applies to everyone, but the finance teams, they have some of their own rules because they have to follow a bunch more regulations in the finance world. So they might have rules that they apply on top of the ones that we do. And we fully encourage teams doing that. Every organization might have slightly different requirements when it comes to governance. So as long as everyone is following what we make them do from the grand scale, they are free to go do their own micro level governance as well. Getting into our governance strategy, the biggest component to this is how we are structuring our environment. So our environment strategy. This is a journey. We have tried a bunch of things over the last few years, realized it didn't work, and now we are in the process of shifting to a new environment strategy. So keep in mind, everything I'm about to describe is a work in progress for us. We used to have majority of development in our big default environment, which is the environment that everyone at Microsoft has access to build in. And then we had a bunch of other big broadly shared environments that people could request access to and build their stuff in. We realized that was really hard when it came to trying to govern and secure these different resources because the product gives so many controls at the environment level. It's really difficult to properly scope these security and governance controls to what is within the environment if that environment contains 50,000 different apps that are all unrelated and owned by different people. So we're moving away from that strategy, and instead we're trying to shift towards all environments being owned by either an individual person or by a team or a subset of teams building related solutions. A big part of this process is getting people out of the default environment and into other environment types. And that's where the default environment routing capability comes into play. So this is a new capability that's been available for the last, I want to say 6 months, but I have no concept of time anymore, where if you enable default environment routing, any users that try to access or build in the default environment will instead get dropped into their own personal developer environment. It'll get automatically provisioned to them and say, hey, go build here instead. And that is partly why we have such a big increase in the number of environments in our tenant, because people are moving out of default and into those personal developer environments. Now, we're not too worried about the number of environments in our tenant from a governance standpoint, mainly because we've started using groups and rules, which is a new managed environment capability, and it lets us group environments together and apply rule sets to entire groups of environments rather than having to govern each environment individually. I'm seeing questions in the chat, so I'm going to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, I'm going to get to these a little bit later. In terms of, this is routing. This is what routing looks like. So I'd mentioned default environment routing. Like I said, if you try to access the default environment, makers get routed to their own personal developer environments instead. That's what's helping get people out of the default environment. In terms of how we are structuring our tenant to apply governance to environment groups, we're mainly grouping environments currently by environment type based on what their business or development scenario is. So we have 3 main buckets of environments, and each of those environment groups have their own governance scope applied to them. And they kind of go from lower risk to higher risk. Starting from that low risk end of things, we have our personal productivity scenario group. So this is anyone building things just for them, for their own personal productivity. It's not resources that would need to be shared. All of these things should be built in developer environments. Then moving one step up in that risk scale, we have our next group, which is our team collaboration environment group. And this is all of the environments that are used for team collaboration type work. So teams that are working together to build like certain workflows that are just for the team itself, but again, not building like an enterprise level application to be used across the company. And these we want to be built in Dataverse for Teams environments. Then our last group of environment groups is what we call our enterprise development and AI group. This is everything else. This is the riskiest group because it's where all of the production and enterprise type scenarios are being built. And these are all done in sandbox and production environment types. So for each of these environment groups, we have different types of rules applied to them. So again, we're using the groups and rules managed environment capability. So if you're unfamiliar with managed environments or with groups and rules, I highly recommend looking into it because it lets you scale how you're governing and apply these policy sets to groupings of environments based on whatever criteria you define. So that first bucket for us that I mentioned, our personal productivity bucket, these are all of the developer environments in our tenant. This is where the least risky stuff gets built. Thus, it has the lowest compliance overhead, and we're not making the people building in this environment jump through too many hoops. Because of that, provisioning is all self-service, so anyone can go request a developer environment. They don't need special permissions to do so, or they can get one automatically provisioned to them via the default environment routing that I described. The big caveat to these environments is we are locking them down to only allowing one owner, and you can't share stuff. So if it's your personal developer environment, if you build anything in it, you can't share it with other people. You can't add other owners to this environment. It's just for you and you alone. We treat these similar to like a personal OneDrive. So similarly, if the person owning this developer environment leaves the company, that developer environment is going to get deleted. In terms of connector management, so DLP policies, we do allow most first-party connectors in this environment type. All environments in this group get the same standard DLP that allows most first-party connectors, but does block certain actions. All third-party connectors and custom connectors are not allowed in this environment type. And in terms of lifecycle management, it is inactivity-based. So out-of-box feature, if the environment hasn't been used for 90 days, it automatically gets cleaned up by the product. Moving to that next environment group, this is the team collaboration group that I mentioned. This is all the Dataverse for Teams environments in our tenant. These are sort of one step up in terms of risk and in terms of compliance overhead. They kind of fall in the middle of the scale. Provisioning for these also self-service. So anyone at Microsoft can go make something in their Teams team, and it'll automatically create a Dataverse for Teams environment associated with that M365 group. I personally love Dataverse for Teams environments from a governance standpoint because all of the ownership, sharing restrictions, lifecycle management, it's all handled by the M365 group itself. So M365 groups have data sensitivity labels, they have lifecycle and ownership requirements, and the Dataverse for Teams environment that's tied to the M365 group inherits all of that. So it makes governance super easy, at least for me and my team. Then we get to the fun bucket. This is that third environment group for all of our enterprise development and AI solutions. This is where the riskiest stuff lives. These are our sandbox and production environments. These have a specific request and approval process for provisioning. So if you want to get a sandbox or production environment for your team to use, you need to come to my team and specifically request one. That request process involves you telling us why you need the environment, so the business justification, how you plan to use the environment, what sort of capabilities you're going to need, what different connectors you're going to want enabled in that environment. different regulatory scope that you might fall into, like if you're going to have medical data that has to follow HIPAA, if you have financial data that has to follow SOX requirements, that sort of thing. And then we can make sure that any rules that we apply to that environment are specifically scoped to how that environment is being used. These environments do get all of the same DLP policy by default, but users can request a custom DLP policy if they want specific connectors or custom connectors available to them. Again, they just need to request that and give us information on why they need those other connectors, and then give us proof that they've gone through the right security and privacy assessments. Lifecycle management for these environments is also a bit unique. We have our own attestation-based lifecycle management process. So what that means is every 6 months, the owners of these environments are going to get an email from my team saying, hey, please come attest that you still need this environment, that all the metadata associated with it is still up to date and accurate. And if they do that, then we extend the life cycle of the environment for another 6 months. If they don't come in and complete the attestation, we delete their environment. So that's how we make sure that environments in our tenant are still being used and are actually needed and are being managed by accountable owners. So those are our main environment groupings. At this time, it's just 3 flat environment groups based on type, and then we apply the rules based on that environment group. However, in the future, we're hoping to get nested groups as a capability for groups and rules, which means that we can have child groups underneath parent groups. And once we have that, we would like to make this more granular and group environments based on things like geography, so that we can apply geography specific rules because certain areas of the world have different regulations. Data labels, so depending on the data label associated with your resources, there might be like unique sharing restrictions or ownership requirements, as well as different usage scenarios. So like the finance team might want their own nested group that they can manage, apply their own rules to, while still inheriting all the parent rules from our tenant level scope. I'm going to pause because I just said a ton of stuff and I see there's a lot of discussion in the chat. Maybe if you have any questions, if you could use the raise hand feature and I could try to go through those. Otherwise, Ryan, if you could help call out any key questions in the chat I could get to.
Yeah, Leanne, I actually captured some of these questions, so I'll read them to you and we can kind of address these in real time. And if anybody has any follow-up as we get through some of these, please chime in. So first question is, are environment owners required to go through any sort of training?
No, not technically. So for developer and Dataverse for Teams environments, because they are more locked down, where we like don't allow certain types of sharing, we only allow specific lower risk connectors. This is where most people who don't have a technical background or are new to Power Platform are likely to be building, and we don't require any training there. When you fall into that enterprise development bucket and start building in a production environment, we don't have specific training requirements that people go through, but there are compliance reviews that come into scope. So if you have a sandbox or production environment, you need to go register that environment in one of our internal service tracking tools, which then tracks to make sure you do a biannual privacy review, a security review, have a threat model associated with your environment. And all of those different components, we don't provide training for, but if you are new to that, you'll probably need to go read documentation or do some of the available training from the security teams to learn how to build a threat model or that sort of thing. But we don't have requirements ourselves. As long as you have done those compliance reviews correctly and continue to do them on the frequency that they are required, you're allowed to continue owning your environment. We're putting a lot of trust into our users that they sort of know what they're doing well enough to use the platform. But again, to a certain extent, that's why we are trying to put guardrails in place so that people who don't have a full understanding of everything can't go and do something super silly.
Perfect. Next question. Why developer environments for personal productivity versus sandbox?
Great question. Personal developer environments are smaller and cheaper and easier to govern. A sandbox environment is very similar to a production environment, where it's like a full-fledged Dataverse environment. It's going to cost you more money and it's a lot more resource intensive. Developer environments are easier for us to lock down and control. They're also sort of like a light version of Power Platforms, so having a large amount of them, aka 45,000, is not going to cost the same amount as if we had 45,000 sandbox environments, which are like full Dataverse environments. Developer environments have a capacity limit and they have other nuances to them that make them better for individual usage. The way we're treating sandbox environments is because they're in that enterprise development bucket, we're telling people that they need both a sandbox and a production environment to build an enterprise solution. So sandbox environments should be for any pre-production work, your dev, your test, whatnot. And then your production environment is for like imported managed solutions only. And you'll need to use both of those types for a proper ALM if you're building an enterprise solution. Developer environments, the SKU just works really well for personal productivity. It can be used as a sandbox. You just, in our tenant, wouldn't be allowed to share anything that you're developing there. If you're doing pre-production work in a developer environment and then want to ship it and deploy it and share it more broadly, you would then need to migrate that developer environment resource to a sandbox or production environment type.
Perfect. Thanks, Leanne. Next question is, it's kind of multifaceted here, but it's around our licensing process. What is our licensing process, and are all users at Microsoft licensed as well?
We are the wrong people to talk to about licensing because licensing is unique for us internally as well as our cost structure. We are not billed in the same way that external customers are because we're Microsoft paying ourselves. It's my team handing money off to a different team within Microsoft. So everyone at Microsoft essentially just gets whatever licenses they need. There are some exceptions with more like premium dynamics capabilities that people may need to get approved for. But in general, if someone wants to build something with Power Platform, the license is not an issue because we just have unlimited licenses for things. So if you have licensing questions, I am not the person to answer those, unfortunately.
We can certainly get that. Yeah, no problem. We can certainly get those answered, though. Keep the questions coming. So something that we were kind of discussing a little bit before we opened up the meeting, do we have any mechanism to share Dataverse tables across different environments?
Ooh, kind of, but it gets tricky in that we don't like that happening. Environments are that data container for us, and generally we don't want different containers accessing data from other containers. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, but our general guidance for most users is if you are building solutions for you or your team or for whomever, they should all be contained within a single environment or suite of environments like a sandbox and production environment that work together as a part of a proper ALM pipeline. But we do our very best from a security standpoint to make sure that users cannot access data from other environments' Dataverse tables.
Perfect. So we've got a few more questions, and I think there's more that are showing up in the chat. So we're at halfway through. I want to kind of ask you guys, do we want to save some of these questions towards the end, or do you want to keep going on a few of these right now?
How about I keep going just to make sure we don't run out of time? Yeah. I don't think we're going to use the full hour, so we should still have lots of time for questions at the end.
Perfect. I'll hand it back over to you then.
Cool. So that was our environment strategy. That's how we're structuring our tenant and making sure that the right rule sets are applied to each of these environment types. The other component to this is our like tenant level security controls. DLP being rebranded as connector management. So you may have heard both terms. This is very foundational to how we're governing and securing Power Platform. This is what controls what connectors and connector actions are allowed for each environment, noting that DLP policies are applied at the environment level currently, though coming sometime in the future, they will be allowed to be applied per environment group. So our security team has gone through and they've analyzed all of the first party connectors for like risk level and then assigned them to certain DLP policy packages. So depending on the type of environment that you are building in our tenant, you will get a standard DLP policy specific to that environment type. So all developer environments get a developer DLP policy, all Dataverse for Teams environments get a Dataverse for Teams DLP policy, and then all sandbox and production environments get their enterprise DLP policy. Though the caveat for those is if you have a sandbox or production environment, you can also request a custom DLP policy if there are certain connectors that you want that aren't available in that standard set. Third-party connectors generally have to go through an additional approval process before they're allowed in environments. And when I say third-party, those are non-Microsoft built connectors. Similarly, custom connectors, if a user or team builds their own custom connector, also needs approval to be allowed in a specific custom environment that people can request. We also have tenant level policies that are enforced through the Power Platform Admin Center. One of the main ones is tenant isolation. So we have tenant isolation rules turned on, which blocks all inbound and outbound traffic to and from our tenant, mainly making sure that our corporate data cannot be sent elsewhere and other people can't access that corporate data. There's also endpoint filtering enabled. I know the product team is working to expand the suite of connectors that have endpoint filtering allowed, but this just lets us specify certain endpoints that can be accessed for certain connectors. So if you're using a connector that might be riskier on that security spectrum, we'll filter so that you can only access specific security approved endpoints with that connector. In terms of enforcement of compliance, there's sort of two components to governance. There's the proactive governance that we do, which is all the controls out of the product that let us block people from doing things in the first place. Some actions can't be blockable just through the nature of how the product works, or it's just not blockable yet. So we do what we call reactive governance on that. And that is my team scanning our tenant and seeing if anyone is doing something that we don't like them doing. A lot of this is just custom policies that we've defined for governing our tenants, stuff like ownership rules for environments. So every environment has to have a certain number of system administrators, and you can't have certain account types in that sysadmin role, like guest accounts or non-Microsoft accounts can't be in the sysadmin role. All of these are custom policies that we apply. And if users do something to no longer be in compliance with those policies, they get notifications from my team saying, hey, please stop. You can't do that. You have X number of days to go fix this. Otherwise, we're going to quarantine and delete your environment. So it's that compliance-based lifecycle management that I mentioned earlier, just making sure that everything in our tenant is in a healthy state or a soon-to-be healthy state. Inventory and telemetry. You can't govern what you can't see. Data is super important if you are trying to properly secure your tenant. We have a bunch of different aspects to our inventory and telemetry approach. The first one and the most foundational one is obviously having a comprehensive tenant inventory. You can do this in a variety of ways. I know a lot of teams are using the COE toolkit, which provides a standard inventory. We're using the out-of-box data export capability. So all of our data is dumped into a data lake that we can then easily consume through Azure Data Explorer. Then we have a report suite built on top of that. So this is all the visualizations that let us view and consume that data in the way that is useful for me and all of the people that I work with. Cost and utilization, mainly to monitor excessive or costly usage. This is super important if you are also not part of Microsoft, because like I said, our cost structure is a little different and we have the luxury of that. But as you are paying for every environment and resource, depending on what your licensing model is, you want to keep an eye on your cost and utilization. I know the product team is working on like a licensing hub and a resource hub that's going to make this a whole lot easier for people to do. So highly recommend using that. And then compliance telemetry. So this is all of the data that my team owns and tracks around what compliance status certain resources are in, if there are violations or certain groupings of environments that are causing more problems than others that we need to keep an eye on. It's all that monitoring that we have to make sure that people aren't doing silly things in our tenant. I'm going to pause again for questions. I do see a hand raised. Krishna?
Krishna, you're on mute.
Yeah, somehow it is not letting me enable my mic.
All right, we can hear you.
Yeah, I was curious as how you were dealing with the usage of like personal information in your data, in your environments. How are you monitoring it and how are you regulating it?
When you say personal data, do you mean like PII, like more sensitive data? I'm gonna assume that's what you're asking. There,
Yeah,
so
sorry,
we use
you broke up over there.
no worries. We use Purview for handling of that extra sensitive stuff, social security numbers, medical data, people's addresses, all of that. Purview, which is Microsoft's data governance solution, is scanning and will block those credit card numbers, super highly classified items. Everything else we're relying on privacy reviews for. So if you have access to certain data sets in our corporation, you have to go through privacy reviews to tell the privacy team how you are consuming the data or using it, whether you're a data controller or consumer. Data controller or processor. The product does not have MIP, so Microsoft Information Protection sensitivity labeling across the entire product yet. They are working on it. So there isn't a lot of native data flow control based on data classification yet in the product. So we are relying on Purview and other scanning to track that in the interim. Not sure if that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Amit?
Me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, I have a question on managed environment. I run a citizen development program in my company, and where we have one dedicated environment where SID developers comes in and they build their Power Automate solutions. And we do need managed environment, but I guess one of the requirements of having a managed environment is everyone should be on the premium license, right? If somebody's using Power Automate, there needs to have a premium license, and that is something which is like, of course, very expensive, for giving everyone in the company a premium license. And we need managed environment not just for routing, but also to implement pipeline. So wanted to know, is there a way we can is there a way to avoid or prevent this by default constraint of having everyone on premium? Because we want to leverage manage and we don't understand why there is a linkage between this feature and everyone should have premium. So never understood that, by the way, why Microsoft has done that.
Yeah, so managed environments are a paid capability. I am not part of the team making those decisions, so you can pass that feedback on to the product team. But building these governance controls costs money, so that is how the Power Platform governance and security teams are funding the work that they are doing currently. So if you can choose not to use managed environments and all of the groups and rules capabilities that come with it. But then obviously you'll either need to use your own tooling or the COE toolkit or other means to do the same thing if you're interested in having a similar infrastructure. We have chosen to make everything managed because using managed environments, having groups and rules, it makes our lives much, much easier rather than us having to build everything ourselves. But I don't have a good answer.
No problem.
For you.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I was hoping that that's fine if there is some way to avoid it. But one last question, maybe an extension to on this is, what environment strategy would you recommend for a citizen development program where hundreds or thousands of employees are building? Do you prefer or do you recommend having a developer environment sort of setup, or a database data was driven environment where everyone is working on a single environment and weighing in all the pros and cons?
So for the first 5 or 6 years, 7 years of us having Power Platform enabled in our tenant, we did the latter. We had all citizen developers that wanted to build anything personal productivity related or just play around with Power Platform, they all built in the default environment. And honestly, it just got really difficult to govern and secure because, again, a lot of the controls that you get through the product for governance and security are applied at that environment level. So if everything is in the same environment, they all get those same rules applied to them. And you can't, you don't have a good way to segment the different solutions that are being built. Everyone's going to get access to that same database within the default environment. Everyone's got access to the same resources. It got too chaotic for us personally, which is why we have since shifted to encouraging everyone to have their own personal developer environment. I believe that is the recommendation from the product group as well, is they are highly encouraging people to use those personal developer environments for citizen development, personal productivity, that sort of thing. That would be my recommendation, but it really depends on what your risk tolerance is, how you want to go about doing your tenant administration.
Okay. Makes sense.
All of that.
Okay, thank you.
And no worries. And let's take one more question, and I want to let Ryan get through his slides as well. Greva, apologies.
Yeah. Hi. Yes, Lynn. In your previous slide, you have mentioned that you are using some Azure data lakes data set to monitor the compliance data sort of thing. So I have never used this kind of thing. We are using COE toolkit to monitor some of these reports. So what is this actually you are referring it here, and how can we get the inventory and telemetry?
So it's actually the same data source. The COE toolkit is built on top of data export. So it'd be the same source of data coming to you. The COE toolkit just does that data transformation and visualization for you. We're not using the COE toolkit, so we're just grabbing that data directly and dumping it into our own data lake to then consume, visualize however we want. But it's the same like out-of-box inventory solution that's available.
Okay, so do you suggest like using the COE toolkit for the monitoring purpose, or do we also go with this kind?
Yeah, if the COE toolkit is meeting your needs currently, there's no reason why you would need to pivot elsewhere. It's honestly a great solution for most people that are using the toolkit. the COE toolkit just did not scale to how massive our tenant was a couple years back when we first tried it. They have since made a ton of scalability improvements, so it might work for our tenant now. But the main reason we're not using it is just because we had too much stuff. But if you're not having any scalability issues, the COE toolkit's going to give you the same data set that data export is, because it's just built on top of data export.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Just want to make sure that we are not following anything different than what Microsoft is following. So,
No, same thing.
Okay.
And with that, I would love to hand off to Ryan, because he's much smarter than I am and has more important things to say. Ryan, feel free to take control.
Thank you, Leanne. Appreciate the compliment. I don't know. I'm not smarter than Leanne, by the way. Leanne, she's kind of the brains of the operation. I'm just the guy who presses the buttons. So yeah, let's take a quick look. Tenant administration internally at Microsoft. Obviously, we have quite a bit of scale when it comes to managing the platform and the service all up. We do have the wonderful privilege of testing new features and ensuring that they are enterprise ready before it reaches the customer. At the end of the day, we are a customer of ourselves, customer zero. So we do want to make sure that these features are ready for deployment. And what a better place to scale test than our own tenant. So we kind of take pride in that. We make sure that there's plenty of approvals in place, making sure all these capabilities have the right checks and balances and have gone through the proper review processes internally before we release them internally as well. So we do have internal tenant trust reviews where we get all the stakeholders together and ensure everyone is on board with the changes that need to be made. We want to ensure that these features are tested in a test tenant first. We do not just jump right into our production tenant and test these. So part of my role is utilizing test tenants to scale test on a small scale first and figure out how we can copy and paste those tests into a production ring for a more stable deployment. A great example of that was actually when we started the environment routing with the managed environments. Being able to scope that test down to security groups first. My personal fear was that we turn this thing on and 100,000 environments get created in a day. Didn't want to take down the service. So that's just one example of how we try and make sure that features like that are available before we do release them. So we work really closely with the product group and the program managers on that. Obviously, when it comes to readiness, again, we make sure our change management controls are all in place, proper communications are ready before we do move forward with any changes, and that the proper training and materials are available, FAQ pages, tech articles that we can reference people to kind of get more information on the changes that we're making internally, and then ensuring we have the right support structure in place as we roll out these new features. So to emphasize a little more on that, when those new features come in, we want to make sure that they're dependable, not only for smaller scale, but also the larger scale tenants. Again, testing in our own tenant is one of the largest ones. So the product group will often come to us and say, hey, we want to make sure this works in our test tenant, but now we want to see it work at scale. We've certainly gathered some improvements to a lot of the features and how they load in the interface, how the Power Platform Admin Center UI is taking inventory of large environment pools and making sure things like the environment groups page loads relatively quickly. So that's a fun part of my job. And then after that, we make sure that the features we're releasing internally have a positive business impact when they go live as well. So we sit on these features, we implement them, we test drive them, and we provide that feedback back to the product group as an initial feedback, so to say, before we provide that to the customer. Again, we are the customer, so if there's a pain out there that you're feeling, we've probably felt it. At the same time, we do our best to make sure anything we do internally, we try as best we can to do it out of the box. We want our product to have that, so that's kind of what we preach back to the product groups. And then the program managers and the software engineers, making sure that they have the proper governance controls. So whether it's DLP or something we're introducing through environment groups, If it's a policy that Leanne and her team want to ensure we put in place, we'll all collaborate together. Collaboration at scale is kind of the biggest way this is all possible. Like I said, we might be a small team, but when you collaborate effectively, this kind of scale, governing this kind of service that has a lot of potential for open endpoints and places where things can get a little sketchy. That's really what it comes down to, just ensuring proper collaboration. And like I said, what we do a lot of is the documentation is huge for us, even internally. We'll work with the program managers and the project teams and ensure that documentation is up to date. And if we do have to build any IT glue or stop gaps, we will leverage the publicly available APIs to build out those tools. And we will fact check our own documentation, providing feedback to the product teams to ensure that what you're also reading is accurate. So that's a lot of what we do, and internally, again, just vetting out these features and drinking our own Kool-Aid, if you will, for lack of a better term. I'll pause there for any questions on tenant administration. In the chat here. There's a lot of good questions in the chat and the Q&A, so definitely keep them coming. As Leanne mentioned, the licensing ones, unfortunately, were not really the best ones to ask.
I know there is a exciting licensing update coming that I believe is being announced at Ignite. I don't know if I'm allowed to say what that is, so I'm not going to. But stay tuned at Ignite. I know there's going to be a change, a positive change to licensing for some of these capabilities.
Thank you, Leanne. Let's see here. So I think I'm going to move forward and just review some of our internal support and service models that we have put in place internally. So a lot of what we want to ensure is that our own employees have what they need and they can leverage self-service processes to get it quickly, but also stay within the guardrails that we've defined. So for that reason, we have our own ALM packages kind of ready to be deployed, or ALM services for ready to package and deploy solutions that we've kind of already vetted out, and ensuring the proper controls are in place along the way. We don't want people just running wild. I know training was mentioned earlier. There's a lot of documentation. Is it required? In some senses, as those annual reviews happen, yes. And then, we want to reduce any sort of repetition to those templates. So with our basic offering, we do have the catalogs available with all those templates, and people can reuse most of the components that's available in those. So internally supporting our own employees and users, we have user communities available through Teams channels and various champions programs. We have internal support teams for ticketing. As mentioned, we have one head covers about 150 monthly tickets, and then we have architect for technical assistance, have a resource available for that. But then also we do have tier 2 support. So if there is anything that they can't handle at tier 1, they will escalate internally to us, and we collaborate internally with them as well. We do get some tickets, some real head scratchers, so we'll take those on and build what we need to build, but also work with the program managers and product teams to make sure that we're accomplishing the missions we're setting out and achieving the goals here. And then again, training is huge. We do have some internal offerings, app in a day, admin in a day workshops. We have office hours. I'm not sure if anyone has attended and offers office hours for the Power Platform, but those are super informational. Definitely keep an eye out for those. And then also our SharePoint site with tenant-specific documentation internally and how we expect to build and use the service internally. And then we do, as mentioned, we had a half a resource for architectural consultations, but we also do have trusted suppliers for obviously speed and compliance when these deployments do go live. And we want to empower our users internally. So we try to make sure stuff like this is available on our internal SharePoint sites. I will pause there. Leanne, do you want to add anything to that that section before we pause for questions?
No, I have nothing to add. I'm just trying to go through the chat for questions, but I guess last 4 minutes if we want to take questions from people with hands raised, and then we can try to get to any others via chat after.
Sounds good. I see one hand raised. If you want to take yourself off mute.
Okay, yes. So I think the initial part of the presentation, Leanne mentioned about developer environments and using that for most of the development. But most of the time what happens is you start building an app and then it grows and grows, and now you want to share that app with a larger organization, right? So in that perspective, so at that point, do you tell developers to move that app to like I'm going to call it federated environments? And then
Yes, exactly.
But my question actually is, when you are trying to do that, do you use ALM pipelines to do it? And if yes, then let's say we have 15,000 makers, then do you have to create 15,000 pipelines, each pointing to their federated environment?
It's a great question. We are still working on our strategy for using pipelines. The current pipeline capabilities don't quite work yet in our tenant, just because we have custom environment provisioning processes that we've built that are not native to the product, and the pipelines don't plug into those because we were Microsoft and decided to do things special. So at this time, in most cases, we tell people to just package their solution, export it as a zip, and then re-import it into whatever correct environment is available to them. Or we do have instructions for them on how to use a pipeline if they choose to do so. The issue with the out-of-box pipeline capability is that it doesn't necessarily speed up the process at all, just because we do have those custom provisioning steps that are blockers. But it's a work in progress for us. If you at your company are not doing things in weird ways like we are, and don't have your own custom provisioning processes that make things confusing, pipelines are awesome. Highly encourage you to use them if you can.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe later, but I would like to know what are the custom provisioning steps and make sure we are not doing it. So maybe later, Leanne, but yeah, I would like to know that. Thank you so much for your answer. Thanks.
No worries.
I see a couple other hands raised. If you want to pull yourself off of mute.
Yeah, Krishna, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I posted my question in the chat as well. How are you handling the seat occupancy? Oh, sorry, I posted like a set seat occupancy in the developer environments with respect to support. Like, let's say a support person has to go in and help out and with an administrative privilege on a particular developer environment, right? I don't want that support person to have already admin access to that environment, but I would like him to go in when required, help out, and then pull back, like a PIM, if you will, from Azure. Is there any special way you are handling that today, or it's just as and when needed, the tenant admins are giving those permissions?
That's a great question. So I believe this has been rolled out. This has always been a pain point with kind of the Dataverse and the way the roles are configured. Historically, yes, if you were a Power Platform admin or D365 admin, you were listed as a sysadmin in those environments. There has been a recent feature added where you can go into the environment page in the Power Platform Admin Center and add, once you're elevated, add as a member, so that we're not, it follows more in line with a PIM strategy. So you will only be elevated when needed. See if I can find the documentation. I will drop that in the chat as well. All right. think we have
So guys, I
time
know we're at the top of the hour. I just want to make
Yeah.
sure if y'all are good for continuing with a few more questions. I've captured a lot of the ones that weren't answered in the chat already, so we can try to get those answered and out to the distro of everybody that both attended and registered. But again, I just want to be cognizant of everybody's time in case other meetings need to be had.
I have about 5 more minutes, so I'm happy to take the last 2 questions from the
Okay.
hands and then help out offline after with remaining questions.
Perfect. Harrison. Oh, I think Harrison just dropped. Daniel.
Yeah, I had a question. I was curious your thoughts from a governance perspective of the new Git integration, if that's going to change anything on how you're governing, and any thoughts on that?
So we generally use Azure DevOps internally. My team is not in charge of like code governance, and like we focus very specifically on low code, no code developed items. So as soon as there is need for Git integration, it's out of my scope from a governance standpoint. So I don't know the answer to that. Ryan, do you know how Microsoft's handling this?
Cannot say that I do, unfortunately. I don't want to speak to it without
Yeah.
having proper knowledge on that.
Yeah, I just know it was, a new feature that they just announced, integrating with Power Platform. I was just more curious from your perspective if you're already thinking of any concerns or anything that it's going to change how you're going to govern.
Not at this time, but we can keep you posted if that changes.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. So great conversation, guys. Leanne, Ryan, thank you so much. Clearly, this has been a very, like I mentioned at the beginning, a topic that has been requested quite a bit, and I think we've left quite a bit on the table as well. So maybe we can schedule a follow-up conversation at some point with this team of users. Before we all drop, I do want to let everybody know we've got another Master Series session scheduled for tomorrow around Microsoft 365 Copilot, stepping a little bit outside of just the Power Platform. But again, this has been highly requested, and we've got a couple of technical specialists that will be speaking to this one. So there's a QR code there. I'll drop a link in the chat as well so you can register. And then we've got Ignite, Microsoft Ignite coming up next week. If you're not able to make it, that's completely fine. We are capturing everything that we can. And after Thanksgiving and the beginning of December, we will be holding a recap of Microsoft Ignite, many of the exciting announcements and mostly things that we'd expect to see around the Power Platform and Copilot Studio. So there is a vanity URL alongside a QR code. Again, I'll drop a link in the chat for folks to register. And if you've already got the link to the Power Platform Master Series Hub, those will be available to register on there. So looking forward to seeing you guys there. Like I said, we'll get some of these additional questions answered for you. And you guys enjoy your day. Thanks again for joining. And Ryan, Leanne, thanks again so much. This has been very informative, so I appreciate you.